If children were brought into the world by acts of pure reason, would the human race exist? Arthur Schopenhauer. This question, posed by Arthur Schopenhauer in the 19th century, echoes today with disturbing force. There is a philosophical provocation that few have the courage to face. The act of creating a life may be the most thoughtless gesture we perform in the name of love. There are people who will never walk. There are people who will never hear their own voice. There are children going hungry right now as you watch this video. And yet we call birth a miracle of life. The uncomfortable truth that Schopenhauer presents us with is not just a pessimistic theory. It is an invitation to compassionate lucidity. When a woman becomes pregnant, the world celebrates. But no one questions what is really being created there. Not just a baby, but a consciousness doomed to experience pain, loss, frustration, and eventually death. Behind the serene face of every newborn, there is an unsolicited sentence. An existence that never asked to begin, but will now have to bear the burden of being, not by choice, but by the decision of others. Schopenhauer, perhaps the most misunderstood of modern philosophers, was not just a bitter pessimist. He was a profound observer of the human condition, who saw compassion as the only true virtue. And it is precisely out of compassion that he invites us to question, is bringing someone into the world really an act of love? Or could it actually be an act of profound, unintentional cruelty? Schopenhauer's philosophy challenges us to look beyond the veil of illusions that nature so conveniently places before our eyes. A veil that makes us celebrate life as a gift, when for many, it can be a sentence without appeal. In this video, we will delve into the depths of this question, not to spread melancholy, but to seek a more lucid, more honest, and perhaps even more radical compassion than the one we have been taught. A compassion that makes us think twice before imposing existence on a being who never asked for this so-called gift. The propaganda of life as a gift is one of the most successful in human history. From the cradle, we are conditioned to be grateful for our existence, even when it becomes unbearable. It is a powerful narrative, almost impossible to question without being seen as ungrateful or disturbed. But it is precisely this narrative that Schopenhauer, with unusual courage, dared to challenge in the 19th century when he wrote, "Life swings like a pendulum, back and forth, between pain and boredom." For him, suffering is not an accident of existence. It is its very essence. Look around with clear eyes, without the filter of evolutionary self-preservation that has been imposed on us. What do you see? A terminally ill child who will never know adolescence. A man who worked his entire life to die in poverty. A woman who wakes up every day to face chronic pain that medicine cannot explain. We are not talking about exceptions. According to the World Health Organization, more than 700,000 people commit suicide every year. Depression is the leading cause of disability on the planet. Nearly 1 billion people live in extreme poverty. We are facing a cruel existential lottery, where some win moments of joy interspersed with moderate suffering, while others receive a sentence of uninterrupted torture. Schopenhauer identified in this scenario what he called will, a blind, irrational, and insatiable force that drives all existence. It is not an abstract concept, but something we feel in our skin with every unfulfilled desire, every frustration, every irreparable loss. It is the engine that keeps us alive and, paradoxically, what makes us suffer. The foundation of human existence is suffering, he wrote, not out of gratuitous pessimism, but out of careful observation. Pleasure, according to his analysis, is always negative. It is only the momentary absence of pain, a brief interval between two waves of discomfort. We satisfy one desire only to make room for another, in an endless chain that never finds permanent fulfillment. The child who is beaten and then hears, "It's for your own good." The young person with depression who hears, "There are people worse off than you." The abandoned elderly person who still blames themselves for complaining. These are all examples of the blind romanticization that Schopenhauer exposed as a mechanism for perpetuating the species, not a truth about reality. When a baby is born, we celebrate without questioning what we have just done. We condemn someone to desire without ever finding complete satisfaction, to suffer inevitable losses, to face the agonizing awareness of their own mortality. And we call this a gift. The question is not whether there will be suffering that is guaranteed, but only what its intensity, duration, and distribution will be throughout a lifetime. Some will bleed every day, while others will live relatively sheltered by circumstances of birth, geography, genetics, or economics. The lucidity Schopenhauer offers us is not a door to nihilism, but to deeper compassion. When we tear away the veil of the illusion that life is always good, we can finally face the moral responsibility of bringing someone into the world. Think of the pains that are never forgotten. The mother who lost a child and never slept properly again. The abuse survivor who lives in constant dissociation. The person with chronic pain who wakes up every day as if they are going to the scaffold. These stories are not exceptional. They are everywhere, hidden behind social smiles, medicated, silenced, but real. And when we understand this, when the veil is completely torn before our eyes, we are forced to ask the question that no one wants to ask. What right do we have to launch another consciousness into this scenario without their prior consent, knowing that suffering is guaranteed and happiness only a possibility? Wake up, work, pay bills, sleep, and repeat it all over again the next day. Life goes by like this, and one day you realize that time has slipped away. Dreams were postponed. Opportunities went unnoticed. This happens because no one ever taught you how to see the game of life the right way. But there is another path. If you want to reach the next level, you need to access new knowledge. And that's exactly what you'll find in the White Rabbit Codes. This book will open your eyes to what is really happening. You'll understand why you keep getting stuck in the same cycles, learn how to escape autopilot, and start seeing the opportunities that were always there. And finally, you'll make decisions that truly lead to the life you've always wanted. If you feel ready for this change, the link is in the pinned comment. You'll be surprised at how simple it can be to increase your prosperity. Success is a decision. The choice is yours. It is through reason that we can transcend the blind imperatives of nature. This is what Schopenhauer understood when he formulated what we now call the asymmetry between existing and not existing, a cold, rational, but deeply compassionate analysis of the moral mathematics of life. Let us establish this equation with the philosophical rigor it deserves. If someone is born and experiences pleasure, that is good. If someone is born and experiences pain, that is bad. If someone is not born, and therefore does not feel pain, that is, good. An absence of evil is always positive. And here is the crucial point. If someone is not born, and therefore does not feel pleasure, that is not bad, because there is no one to miss that pleasure. This asymmetry between the absence of pain, positive, and the absence of pleasure, neutral, is what Schopenhauer, in his philosophy of compassion, would identify as the rational basis for questioning the act of procreation. "The world is my representation," he wrote, indicating that all reality is filtered through consciousness, a consciousness that, once created, is doomed to suffer. Think about it. No one regrets not having existed in the 14th century. No one suffers for not having enjoyed the parties of ancient Greece. Non-existence causes no pain to anyone. But every day, millions deeply regret being alive here and now. For Schopenhauer, the world is a manifestation of the will, a blind and irrational force that permeates everything. Through human consciousness, this will becomes aware of itself and its own suffering. To create a new consciousness, therefore, is to create a new vessel for universal suffering, a new stage on which the tragedy of the will can unfold. The philosopher invites us to see that the absence of suffering is good, even when there is no one to benefit from it, while the absence of pleasure would only be bad if there were someone who felt it as a loss, which, by definition, is not the case for those who never existed. This analysis dismantles the idea that it is worth being born for the mere chance of being happy. It is as if we were forced to play an existential game of Russian roulette, where some spaces contain moments of joy, but others guaranteed in every life contain inevitable pain, loss, illness, and death. A child with a degenerative disease who will never be able to run, talk, or play. A baby abandoned in an orphanage after being born to a rape victim. A young man who at 13 already attempts suicide because he senses that the world was not made for him. If these people had never existed, they would not be losing anything, only being spared a clearly unfair experience. Compassion, for Schopenhauer, arises when we recognize the fundamental unity between all being soul manifestations of the same universal will, all sharing the same essential suffering. This genuine compassion leads us to want to alleviate suffering where it already exists, but also to question whether we should bring more conscious beings into existence to experience it. But the asymmetry goes further. Pleasure is a luxury, pain is a debt. You can live a whole life without great joys, and no one will consider that an absolute tragedy. But if you are raped, tortured, or experience deep grief, everyone will recognize that as intolerable. Why? Because we instinctively know that pain carries more moral weight. "What distinguishes man from animals is the ability to suffer more deeply," observed Schopenhauer. "Our self-awareness amplifies our suffering, for we not only feel pain, we anticipate future pain, relive past traumas, and question the meaning of it all. This awareness also allows us to see the moral asymmetry argument. While pleasure is contingent, uncertain, and variable, pain is guaranteed, universal, and often overwhelming. The most intense pleasure hardly compensates for the deepest pain, as they are qualitatively distinct experiences, not mere opposites on the same scale. Thus, the ethical equation of existence reveals itself to be unbalanced. Non-existence is not deprivation, it is protection." Schopenhauer, contrary to what many think, was not a misanthrope. He was someone who felt the pain of the world so deeply that he could not ignore this moral mathematics. His philosophy does not call for hatred of life, but rather radical honesty about its true nature. In this reflection on pain and existence, we find the central point. It is not that life cannot have sublime moments. It is that these moments do not necessarily compensate for or justify the complete package of inevitable suffering. And if we cannot guarantee that they will compensate, what right do we have to make that bet with someone else's life? When we honestly examine the reasons why people decide to have children, we rarely find pure altruism. What we see are reflections of desires, needs, and pressures that have little to do with the well-being of the child who will come into existence. Schopenhauer identified this contradiction with disturbing clarity. The will, that irrational and blind force, perpetuates itself through the illusion of romantic love and the desire to reproduce. What we feel is a free choice is, in fact, nature manipulating us for its own ends, the perpetuation of the species, indifferent to individual suffering. "Nature cares nothing for the happiness or unhappiness of the individual," he wrote, "only for the preservation of the species." This irrational will, which Schopenhauer saw as the essence of the world, causes us to believe we are acting out of love when, in reality, we are merely obeying biological impulses disguised as conscious choices. Ask a couple why they want a child, and you will rarely hear, "We want to give someone the chance to experience suffering, loss, frustration, and death." Instead, you will hear, "We want someone to love. We want to start a family. I want to see a piece of myself in the future. I don't want to grow old alone." Notice the structure of these sentences. They all begin with, "I want," or "we want." This has a name: reproductive selfishness. People do not have children primarily for the sake of the being who will come into existence. They do so for reasons that benefit themselves, while the supposed benefit to the child is a justification created after the fact. A brutal and real example. A couple has a child with a rare disease. The child is bedridden, unable to speak, without autonomy. The parents say, "He is our joy. He has taught us so much." But what about him? Who can guarantee that this limited life of constant pain was worth living? Does the parents' love justify their child's suffering? Or is this just a rationalization to deal with guilt? For Schopenhauer, the greatest moral virtue lies in the denial of willen, the ability to refuse the blind impulses of nature and act out of reason and genuine compassion. Refusing to procreate can therefore be an act of moral transcendence, a victory of ethical consciousness over biological determinism. People have children to save marriages because they are at the right age, to follow family traditions, or simply because everyone else is doing it. The child becomes a project, a symbol, a distraction, anything but a being whose autonomy and well-being are the real priority. Even when parents have the best intentions, this does not alter the fundamental fact. They have created a being capable of suffering without its consent. This is what makes the act of bringing someone into existence so ethically problematic. It is not a question of bad intentions, but of the impossibility of guaranteeing that the other will be grateful for having been brought into existence. Life is a business that does not cover its costs, Schopenhauer observed with bitter irony. When we see proud parents showing off their newborns, we rarely think, a new journey of frustrated desire, inevitable pain, and certain death has just begun. Instead, we say, what a blessing. Schopenhauer forces us to ask, what is so blessed about giving someone the capacity to suffer? If we could truly transcend our selfishness and think of the other potential, wouldn't it be more compassionate to spare them? Most people who claim to love life are, according to Schopenhauer, under the influence of an evolutionary anesthetica, useful illusion that keeps us functioning even when everything falls apart. Our perception of life is shaped by mechanisms that favor survival, not truth. The fact that we think life is worth living is not a philosophical argument. It is merely a symptom of an adaptive bias that nature has instilled in us. Evolutionary psychology confirms this Schopenhauerian view with the concept of optimistic bias. Even in adverse conditions, we underestimate our chances of failure, suffering, and death. This is what allows us to continue living, even when the objective reality would be despairing. A disturbing example: people in war zones and extreme poverty continue to have children. It is not ignorance, it is the triumph of blind will over reason. And the problem is that the suffering of children does not interrupt this cyclete, continues to replicate itself, generation after generation. This is the silent tragedy of existence, according to Schopenhauer. Each generation suffers, but is conditioned to believe that it is worthwhile, unconsciously condemning the next to the same fate. Procreation thus becomes a chain of self-deception, where each link represents a new consciousness condemned to experience the cycle of the never-satisfied will. Behind the "we want a baby" may lie only the reflection of an existential fear, the fear of being irrelevant, forgotten, of leaving no mark. And for the child, this means being thrown into the world to fulfill a role they never chose, to give meaning to someone else's life. Is this content making you reflect and sparking new ways of thinking? If so, click the super thanks button just below the video. It's a way to say thank you and help me bring more content like this to those who need to reflect on life. It is curious how the deepest truths often reveal themselves as paradoxes. And perhaps the greatest of these is this: the greatest expression of love may be precisely not to create what we could love. Schopenhauer led us to the edge of this philosophical abyss, where authentic compassion invites us to transcend our own reproductive impulses. Compassion is the foundation of morality, wrote Schopenhauer. When we recognize that the suffering of others is as real as our own, that there is no fundamental separation between beings, we arrive at a radical conclusion. Perhaps the greatest act of compassion is to spare someone all the pain that existence will inevitably bring. The unborn lacks nothing. It does not cry, desire, or experience disappointment. It is protected in the absolute peace of non-being. It knows no hunger, rejection, illness, or loss. Non-existence is the only state in which suffering cannot even begin, and therefore, the only one in which we are free from the moral responsibility of causing harm to another. This lucid surrender to the argument for non-procreation is not giving up, it is transcendence. It is the ability to see beyond biological and cultural imperatives, beyond vanity and reproductive selfishness. It is human beings using their consciousness to overcome the tyranny of blind will that Schopenhauer identified as our essence. The greatest act of compassion may be the one no one noticed, the child you didn't have, the life you spared from existing. When we talk about kindness, we think of giving, protecting, caring, but we rarely consider that the most ethical act may be precisely not to do, not to give birth, not to push another being into the world. However, here we arrive at the final paradox, the point where Schopenhauer's own philosophy finds its deepest complexity. For the same philosopher who warned us about the suffering inherent in existence also recognized that, through art, contemplation, and compassion, we can find moments of liberation from the will. Life, although intrinsically painful, also contains possibilities for transcendence. There is aesthetic ecstasy in the face of beauty, when we briefly escape the endless cycle of desire and frustration. There is the consolation of music, which Schopenhauer considered the highest of the arts, capable of connecting us directly with the essence of the world. There is selfless love, which allows us to recognize in others the same essence that dwells within us. These moments do not negate the reality of suffering, nor do they necessarily justify procreation. But they remind us that, for those who already exist, there are possibilities for meaning amid pain. Life can be a burden, but it can also be a field of possibilities for transcending the very will that constitutes us. As Schopenhauer wrote, life swings like a pendulum back and forth between pain and boredom. But perhaps, in the brief moments of pause of this pendulum, something meaningful is revealed, not enough to categorically justify imposing existence on others, but enough to give meaning to the journey of those who are already here. This is the productive tension that emerges when we honestly face the question, recognizing both the inevitable pain and the possibilities of meaning, questioning the reproductive impulse without denying the value that life can have for those who already exist, understanding the asymmetry between being and not being without falling into absolute nihilism. The reproductive decision, when made with full awareness of this moral complexity, ceases to be an impulsive or culturally determined act. It becomes a radical exercise in ethical responsibility, whatever the final choice may be. What Schopenhauer teaches us is not to hate life, but to face it without comforting illusions, to recognize its beauty and its horrors, its sublime possibilities and its guarantees of suffering. And, from this lucidity, to make choices that minimize suffering our own and that of potential future beings. Perhaps the deepest paradox is this: the more we are able to find meaning in our own existence, the more questionable it becomes to impose that same existence on others. For the ability to transcend suffering through art, love, and contemplation does not eliminate the fundamental question, what right do we have to throw someone into this battle without their prior consent? At the end of this philosophical journey, we do not arrive at absolute answers, but at a deeper awareness of the moral complexity of our actions. Perhaps what remains is a more lucid compassion, one that recognizes both the suffering inherent in existence and the dignity of those who already exist and seek meaning. The silence of non-being may be more compassionate than the noise of existence, but for those who are already here, immersed in the whirlwind of Schopenhauerian will, there remains the possibility of transcendence through authentic compassion, aesthetic contemplation, and love that recognizes in others the same universal essence. And perhaps this is the most lucid surrender of all, to accept that we came into the world without choice, but that we can choose how to live and whether or not we will perpetuate the cycle. True freedom, as Schopenhauer suggested, does not lie in blindly following the impulses of the will, but in understanding them and, when necessary, transcending them in the name of a compassion deeper than any individual desire.
If you've made it this far, you've already taken a step beyond most people. You're subscribed to the channel, you watch the videos, you reflect on every idea. Now the question is, how far do you want to take this? If you want to take the next step and truly apply this knowledge to your life, the White Rabbit Codes is ready for you. The link is in the pinned comment. Remember, success is a decision. The choice is yours. Count on me and follow the White Rabbit.